Don't forget this man. He has plenty to do with the terrifying mystery that causes this glamorous woman to risk her life and reputation in a reckless experiment. A woman who, because of her consuming love for this man, gambles everything to unlock the fearful secret in his heart. What insidious meaning did he read into the markings on a tablecloth? Why, even when he held his sweetheart in his arms, did he gaze in fear at the dark lines of her robe? These are some of the clues in the motion picture which bears Hollywood's most distinguished mark of quality.
Welcome to the 31st episode of Foreign Correspondence
Deeper into Hitchcock
podcast. My name is Michał Leszczyk and I'm joined as always by my co-host
Sebastian Smolinski. Hello everyone.
Yes, this is the third year of our project. Last time we told you about two very special short films by Hitchcock, Aventure Malgache and Bon Voyage. We discussed them with wonderful Hitchcock scholar Charles Barr. And that was a little bit of a digression in the Hitchcock filmography. Now we are back into the Hitchcock mainstream, which a film that was a huge hit upon release, had several Oscar nominations, including Best Picture, won for Best Music for Miklós Rózsa, and is a film that, from my standpoint, in the year 2022 is completely ridiculous. And I'm saying this as someone who is extremely open to old films, sensibilities of the past, and overall, empathetic approach to culture. I think that Spellbound, because this is the film that we'll discuss today, aged really, really badly in terms of plausibility, in terms of respectability, I would say. It's a film that's literally difficult to take seriously today, which is not to say that it doesn't have its pleasures, its charms, and even its wonderful passages. But this is the thing that I want to say outright. I think that Spellbound is ridiculous, and the only way to love this film, and I do have a lot of affection for it, is to acknowledge the ridiculousness right off the bat. This is the psychoanalytical thriller love story that Hitchcock made in 1945.
This is a very bold opening. Now you cannot stop listening. You want to hear our arguments. I wouldn't be as harsh as Michał, but yes, the movie is totally ridiculous, which is, of course, part of the fun here. And also, I must say, I have a lot of affection for it too. It was probably the first Hitchcock film that I made some kind of presentation around. When I was like a teenager, I discussed the topic Hitchcock and surrealism, right? And of course, which film gives you the better perspective? There's not a single one. Although I had the feeling that besides the famous Dali dream sequence that I'm sure we'll comment upon, the other interesting example is Frenzy and the scene with bags of potatoes in the car. I found it probably the most surreal of Hitchcock's moments. But yes, this is a crazy film. It's a film about psychoanalysis, which on the other hand is difficult to, let's say, psychoanalyze, because almost everything, I would say, is on the surface. The story, the treatment of psychoanalysis. It's very funny at certain points, but I think this is also our sensibility as, precisely as you said, as viewers who like to go into the past, who are attuned to different sensibilities. I think, on the other hand, maybe rejecting some personal opinions, this movie could serve as a perfect example of mid-1940s glossy Hollywood filmmaking, right?
Absolutely. I mean, I already made my point about it being ridiculous, so we can, as I said, we can move past it, because of course it's a very interesting film. I think it's a film that, probably if I showed it to my students without any warning, they probably would laugh or leave. I think, my students are in their 20s. They were born after 9/11, so they're very, very young. But yes, I mean, okay, this is a film that has this gloss, this melodramatic gloss. This is, after all, a David O. Selznick production, which he specifically wanted to center around issues of psychoanalysis. The scientific advisor to the film is actually a woman who was O. Selznick's analyst. She was his therapist. So basically it's a film, it's difficult to imagine even today. It's a film by a major producer that is consulted upon by the producer's therapist. Okay, so this is how you can say, and I'm serious right now, how much in vogue was psychoanalysis at the time. Nowadays I think we are more or less used to therapy culture in general, not necessarily of the psychoanalytical edge, but back then, when you read biographies of people like Judy Garland, for example, or Joseph Mankiewicz, who was extremely interested in psychoanalysis, they all went to their therapist, and they all underwent, and this is very important, some kind of a Freudian treatment, some kind of a Freudian reading of their subconscious. So this is a film made by a director who didn't go to therapy, who made slight fun of psychoanalysis, and yet who was extremely obsessed with his own dream life, who was famous, as Patrick McGilligan says in his book, for recounting his dreams to others. And we have this thriller, basically, which is a sort of like a Freudian whodunit. We have a doctor, a psychoanalyst, played by Ingrid Bergman, who meets a man, and I'm not going to synopsize the whole film, but basically she meets a man played by Gregory Peck, who underwent some severe trauma and is suspected of being a murderer. And this is, of course, a very spoilery show, so we have to spoil it for you. Of course, he isn't the murderer. He's quite convinced that he is, for psychological and psychoanalytical reasons, but the real villain is actually someone else. However, the main romantic / suspenseful storyline in the film is that this very professional, goal-oriented, supposedly frigid woman, played by Ingrid Bergman, opens herself up to this man, a man with a mystery, a man who is hurting in some way, a man who was wounded psychologically, and she slowly, gently unravels the mystery of his psyche by subjecting him to psychoanalysis. So basically every other scene with Gregory Peck has some sort of a clue in it. He looks at a striped pajamas, and suddenly, his eyes go wild. This is another clue to this big mystery. He looks at a fork, he looks at some, small objects, and it's all very heavily stressed by the soundtrack, by the use of theremin, which was a very avant-garde musical instrument at the time, later on to become associated with ghost stories and sci-fi. And basically the whole film tells you, look, this is a clue, this is a clue, this is a clue. And once the psychoanalyst, played by Ingrid Bergman, has all the pieces, the main male character can finally go guilt-free, because this is the theme of the film, the guilt. He actually wrote a book about guilt. Do you think that guilt was very close to Hitchcock?
That's a great rhetoric question. Yes, your summary is perfect of this film. Let me give us an additional bit of context, because yes, you are right that certain figures like Mankiewicz, like Judy Garland, even like Ben Hecht, who wrote or co-wrote the screenplay, they were very much interested in psychoanalysis. But I consulted the great book, highly recommended, Story of Nets by Otto Friedrich, right? The portrait of Hollywood community in the 1940s. And just let me read a short quote. It is a little hard now to realize how esoteric and how controversial psychoanalysis still was in the early 1940s. Sigmund Freud had long been established as a pop oracle, an explicator of sex, but not as the creator of psychiatric system that would solve, as its more ardent supporters believed, many of the fundamental problems of mankind. In America in particular, psychoanalysis was widely regarded as something foreign, alien, and therefore not quite serious, not quite respectable. Well, I think it's a great quote when you think about Spellbound, because there is this tension which we may not grasp nowadays of psychoanalysis, and this is something that Friedrich also describes. Was it a philosophy, basically? Also a way of analyzing culture, analyzing societal tensions, family tensions, or was it a medical treatment, right? Of course, Hitchcock's movie was not sponsored by Psychological Association. It wasn't an advertisement of psychoanalysis. We could say that in the wartime he couldn't provide let's say, or didn't want to provide a proper propaganda. Now, of course, he wouldn't provide a so-called serious movie about psychoanalysis. But there is this context that it's suddenly very fashionable to speak about it, to discuss psychoanalysis, but still it is something strange in US culture. But of course, the influx of immigrants since the 1930s, also to California, makes this ground quite fertile. There are quite a big number of psychoanalysts with Austrian or German roots, sometimes Jewish roots as well, German Jewish roots. So this is all very interesting, but yes, you can sense, I think, in this film that Hitchcock himself was of the camp which treated psychoanalysis as something a bit foreign and maybe alien, something strange, maybe something that could be a narrative device, but not really something that could explain the world. Although, of course, I think the joke of this whole situation is that his movies are usually referred to, and by us as well, as Freudian, right? I mean, all the cigars, props, phallic symbols, fetishism, something we've discussed deeper in Rebecca, it's all there. But when he makes a movie about psychoanalysis, it turns into a maybe kind of a comedy, we could say.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, and we should also add that there is a disclaimer at the beginning of the film which basically explains to the viewers what psychoanalysis is, and that it's a way of treating human soul. So this was probably also aimed at, let's say, the middle America that could be suspicious of this, as to use another title, dangerous method. But yes, I mean it's almost touching that, of course, Hitchcock's films are huge giveaway. I mean, his films are basically his therapy, right? I mean, he keeps making Freudian slips in his films, and of course we find it fascinating to psychoanalyze him through his films. But once he approaches the psychoanalysis theme here, it seems, I wouldn't say naive, it seems almost comically single-minded. I mean, he really approaches it as a whodunit. So, okay, we have this thing called psychoanalysis. It uses subconscious, so let's construct a criminal case or criminal riddle which can be solved simply by those, keys or elements or pieces of the puzzle that psychoanalysis will yield. And this is exactly why the movie seems so naive, because we know by now that first of all, Freudianism as such is not really practiced anymore, apart from the huge influence Freud had on our culture. But, no one is undergoing Freudian analysis nowadays.
Maybe Lacanian.
Yeah. So we look this as extremely naive, that, someone looks at a fork and, oh, this is the fork that is related to your mother. And, it's very, very, very naive. But on the other hand, I'm making a big reversal now. I completely think that this movie was probably momentous, very, very important in terms of simply not only of portraying therapy, because even if you look at Nightmare Alley, 1947, which recently had a revival thanks to Guillermo del Toro, who, by the way, remains the person that I would love to have most on this podcast still. This is my biggest dream, to have Guillermo del Toro on our podcast. If you can make it happen, you're wonderful.
Please help us to do that.
Yes, this is the ultimate dream, because del Toro wrote a book on Hitchcock, and he's a fantastic Hitchcock scholar. Anyhow, so in 1947 you have Nightmare Alley, you have some therapy there, but I think that Spellbound is really, really, really important in terms of portraying raw, gentle, naked male emotional life on the screen in 1945. In Polish, this film is called Urzeczona, which basically is a female form. So we hear Urzeczona and we think, oh, okay, we think she's spellbound. But in the original title, it's him who is spellbound, or at least it's it has a double meaning. And when I look at Gregory Peck, who wasn't Hitchcock's first choice for the role, he wanted Cary Grant, but he's so amazingly gentle in the film. He's very soft. He's like the perfect Hitchcock type of this slightly effeminate virile men, Farley Granger, Gregory Peck. It's exactly the type that he, of course, Montgomery Clift in I Confess. So you have this very gentle man, very sensitive man, broken man, wounded man, who is gently approached by Ingrid Bergman, who is, tending to him and who's trying to unravel his bandages, and to look at this wound. This is the year that, the World War II ended. And for the past couple of years, American men were supposed to be, strong, virile, like they shouldn't have too much of an emotional life. And here is this Gregory Peck character, very gentle, very open. And just one scene when he collapses in the operating room at the beginning of the film, and Ingrid Bergman takes him, to bed basically, and he wakes up in bed after this collapse. This makes me think immediately about Vertigo and about Madeline's waking up in Scotty's apartment, after she jumped to the San Francisco Bay, because she's so gentle and vulnerable in that scene. She's only wearing a towel, and her first look is like, will you hurt me, like, will you rape me, whatever. And here it's exactly in this position of complete vulnerability, complete passivity even, is placed the male character, the Gregory Peck character, who wakes up very gentle, very vulnerable, and asks, like, what happened to me. He's the ultimate passive subject in this film. And this is exactly, if you add to this romantic score by Rózsa, right, which is very romantic, very beautiful, actually, the main theme. I think this is a film about male dream life, about male vulnerability, and I think that Gregory Peck in this film is really like a forefather of many of those gentle males from the 50s, like, of course, James Dean and others, who will be extremely, Marlon Brando, who will be opening up on the screen in the 50s. But in this term, and I'm finishing this rant, but yes, absolutely, I think that this is a groundbreaking film, because if you look at the cinema of the 1930s, you won't find men like this. I mean, you will find either strong men or extremely elegant men, but not vulnerable men like this.
This is a great point. The question is, of course, was the war the main reason, right? The returning veterans, and also this changed in 1940s American cinema, getting more noirish, darker, also focused to a large extent on male anxieties, some psychological, pathological state even. Or the film, another film from 1945, The Lost Weekend, right? Also, so yes, you are totally right. But here, even I would say it's maybe even more touching than in The Lost Weekend, which is formatted as a story, we could say, of addiction and some kind of redemption. Here, because of this bizarre plot, this vulnerable man appears as a different, maybe as a less formatted character, I would say, because the focus is on psychoanalysis, Ingrid Bergman, and so on. But my biggest problem with this very generous interpretation is that for me, Gregory Peck isn't convincing in this role. Of course, I'm not the only one. This was also the notion with which I started rewatching Spellbound, right? Knowing this famous words of Truffaut, who said that he doesn't have, he calls that, Gregory Peck lacks, he has lack of expression in his eyes, right? There's that he's
Dead Eyes. There's a podcast now called Dead Eyes.
Yes, Dead Eyes. So he's not a Hitchcockian actor. He's not expressive, and there is this opinion about this film that he is so-called, he gives a wooden performance in this film. I don't know. I agree with your take on the character, but I personally have problems with attuning to this actor. He's starring in so many great movies, but he's almost never convincing for me as a performer. But as a way of adding to, you can maybe respond a bit later if you want to defend Gregory Peck. But for me, it's still Ingrid Bergman's movie. In the terms, I was thinking about this reveal that she goes through. At the beginning, she's also commented upon by her sexist collaborators that she's frozen. She's only thinking about her scientific life and so on. Of course, it's very sexist on the part of her colleagues, but it's a bit like now Voyager, right? When we begin with this, bespectacled, slightly, could say, asexual character and performance, and of course, throughout the movie, Hitchcock changes the gear, and towards the end, we have this amazing close-ups of Ingrid Bergman that Notorious will be, made from, actually. So I think this performance is very convincing, and I think it's pretty bold that, Ingrid Bergman's entrance, the first scene in which we see her, is not very spectacular. It's a gradual reveal. I like this idea of first-rate Hollywood actress being revealed slowly as a beautiful performer and lover.
Mm-hmm. Yes, but there's some kind of, I would say transvestite game going on here, because I don't think, the real sexist here, I think, is Hitchcock, because the her colleagues, I don't know if they are sexist. They're like, you should open yourself up emotionally, but nobody in the film, and this is very modern, actually, I think, says that, oh, you cannot be a good psychoanalyst because you're a woman, mm-hmm. right? It's never that. It's never that. They don't say, oh, you should maybe be home, or something like, maybe you should, raise children. They are not pushing her into this domestic sphere. What they're saying is actually, you are fantastic at what you are doing, but if you want to experience it fully, you should also be a sexual being, right? So this is why the first scene, I don't think, like when her colleague is hitting on her, mm-hmm. I don't think it's like a sexy scene. I think it's like saying that, you should engage fully in what you are studying, right? Mm-hmm. But on the other hand, I think that there is some transvestite game here, because I think she's played like a male character at the beginning. We see her in male pajamas when there's the cigarette, there's the very mundane set of glasses that she mm-hmm. has, mm-hmm. And I think that the scene when Gregory Peck, who, by the way, I don't think is a great actor, but he wakes up in her bedroom and she's wearing this male pajamas. So it's like if you squint your eyes, you could mistake, Ingrid Bergman for another guy, and especially because Gregory Peck is so incredibly similar to Farley Granger in some way. Very soon Hitchcock will actually make a film about two guys who live together, which will be Rope. But I what I find really interesting is that, first of all, I think that Hitchcock's what we already said about his approach to psychoanalysis. Second of all, his approach to Ingrid Bergman, which I think is somehow overlooked mm-hmm. when we discuss Hitchcock blondes and his obsessions. I mean, we will get some big examples of Hitchcock's fetishization of Ingrid Bergman in this film, in next film, in another film. So she will stay with us for a while. She's also a little bit frumpy, like Joanne Fontaine at the beginning of Rebecca. Let's not forget that, right? That she, through this man, she's blooming into full female form or whatever. But I just want to point out one thing, which is that the film starts very strikingly with another woman, this patient who is an nymphomaniac, apparently, extremely sexual. You would even say that she provocatively so, who in the first scene of the film propositions the male caregiver, right? She says, let's sleep together, right? She's an nymphomaniac, and when he refuses her, she scratches him with her nails, and we get this extreme close-up of nails scratching the skin, which I think is a very, very strange thing to do in a major A-class Hollywood film of 1945. This is the kind of thing that Roger Corman will be doing in the 60s, cutting to the ripped flesh, in those biker films or whatever. But here you have Hitchcock, who suddenly makes this jump, and of course, those scratches are exactly like those, skid marks, the marks that are being made by forks and skis in this film. But also, I think this is a huge indicator of this, that there's this power of female sexuality right beneath, which is extremely dangerous. It's voluptuous, it's like Tallulah Bankhead on Lifeboat. Like, she will tear your flesh, if you allow her. So, and then we are being introduced to Ingrid Bergman, who, in her glasses, in the like very, very subdued makeup, but we already saw, what the unbridled female sexuality looks like. We saw the flesh being ripped. So I think this is interesting, that Hitchcock sort of plants this idea in our head and then proceeds, with his little romance. By the way, I just realized that there's a exuberant psychoanalyst at the end of Psycho, when he gives this ridiculous explanation of Norman, right? So but that's 15 years later, so we should stop here.
No, that's a great point. The actress that you're referring to was Rhonda Fleming, in a great role, really bizarre role, but and it's a bit of a campy performance, right? On the verge of being, as the whole movie, of being ridiculous. So when you add Rhonda Fleming to the theremin score, it sounds like Ed Wood at certain points. So definitely, and you are right, this is a great detail, but there are more details like that, I would say. There are these moments when something is off balance in this film, which is also, I think, very interesting in many scenes. Of course, the most famous one is the dream sequence, but even the final shot of a gun, right, of a protagonist killing himself, like out of the blue somehow, right? This is a bit strange, weird, because they have this very rational discussion, and after that he just kills himself. But also maybe a small inconsequential move on Hitchcock's part is that we do not come back to Rhonda Fleming, right? I mean, of course, she's just she has this episode in this film, but I think there is this feeling that we would like to come back to that. And it's also, I think, taste of coming attractions when it comes to 1950s cinema, which was also dealing with mostly in medical terms with feminine hysteria sometimes, or different behaviors. Three Faces of Eve is like this famous film about treatment and psychology and so on. And I think, what's the plot there? The woman thinks that she has three personalities. Something.
She does have three personalities.
She does have, yes, three personalities. So
switches between them.
Yeah. So I would say, yes, this you are right that Spellbound is super important as a portrait of a sensitive man, but also as this turning point when American cinema enters this post-war period. Supposedly, of course, not full of complacency yet, because it's still 1945. The best years of our life will come next year, and so on. This is still a war period of sorts, but still there is like this, the normalcy enters the equation. The 1950s normalcy is somewhere there, and from that perspective, you can look at characters like Rhonda Fleming. She's just, too weird to be part of the, let's say, suburban life. She must be treated. She's a white lioness, and so on.
Yes, and I think this is really so important to realize that, as you mentioned, 1 year later, the Best Picture winner will be Best Years of Our Lives. And, American femininity will be defined, of course, in, idealistic terms by Donna Reed. She will be the perfect daughter. Let's say the Teresa Wright version, but of course Hitchcock explored Teresa Wright's darker potential in Shadow of a Doubt. But here, you start a movie with this nymphomaniac scratching at the man's arm, and then I'm thinking that in this period, like between 1945, this film, 1950, let's say, when of course Kim Hunter will be Stanley Kowalski's horny wife in Streetcar, you have those voluptuous females who really are devouring men not in a demonic way, it's like in a very, very, with gusto. You have in 1949, you have Ann Miller in On the Town, right, dancing and singing about the prehistoric man, right? And in the same film, Betty Garrett takes Frank Sinatra to his cab, and he clearly says he wants to see the town, and she's, no, let's go to my place. It's a very interesting scene, especially from today's sensibility, but she said, no, I want to take you to see Cleopatra's Needle, let's go to my place. And finally she climbs him and she claims him. So here I think that, and by the way, and this is opening up to the next episode, I think that Spellbound only makes sense when you combine it with Notorious. For many reasons. It has the same screenwriter, Ben Hecht. Of course, here the source novel, which I haven't read, by the way, by Hilary St. George Saunders, The House of Dr. Edwards. It's a 1927 novel, which supposedly only gave like a very basic premise of the story. Then it was adapted by Angus MacPhail, who, by the way, collaborated on those French films, shorts. And Ben Hecht, of course, is the main screenwriter, with heavy collaboration from Hitchcock. But I think that those two films are perfect together, and I cannot wait to discuss Notorious with you, because I think that they are like two halves of the same puzzle. That, here Bergman is sort of this rational figure who is slowly exploring the inner life of feelings, passions, and it's all possible to resolve. In Notorious, I think it's much more complicated and more perverse. But yeah, those films work together, so you should watch them together and discuss them together. And of course, they are neighbors in Hitchcock's filmography.
But you mentioned that we rarely think about Ingrid Bergman as this Hitchcock blonde. So you mean what I sensed in your comment was that she's also one of these tormented actresses. This is what you suggest, like that we see in Notorious. We will see that in full swing, right?
I think that I don't know, but I think that with Tippi Hedren, for example, of course, it was the famous iciness of her that made Hitchcock basically assault her, right? In some ways, that Camille Paglia writes about this in her book on the birds. But here, I think that I don't know. My intuition is that Hitchcock could really get close to Ingrid Bergman and to open up her emotional, life in a way maybe more gentle, more emphatic, maybe less violent than he was with Joan Fontaine, whom apparently he was horrible to on the set, and of course Tippi Hedren, who was completely mistreated by him. I think here, I don't know. I don't even know like many details. Maybe you can tell about like what exactly were the relationship, but I feel like he's treating her as an equal. I don't feel this denigrating Hitchcock violence, which is so often the case with his actresses. Here, I don't know. I feel like he's treating her more like he's on an equal footing. I don't know. Maybe it was her European roots or her credentials, let's say, acting credentials, but I don't feel, there's always this icky, unpleasant feeling, especially the more you learn about Hitchcock, the dirtier you feel and the more soiled you feel after watching The Birds, right? Because it was such a horrible treatment of Tippi Hedren. But here, I don't have the feeling. I feel that here, apparently, I think he had much more respect towards her. Maybe she was giving something to him as an actress that the others couldn't. I don't know, but I don't know. What's your take? And we of course will come back to Bergman, right? Yes, Notorious and others.
We'll come back to Bergman, but I think so. We'll do more research and maybe we'll see how it was. But just some details that I remember confirm what you said about her being a bit different. In status, let's say.
There's a whole Donald Spoto book about it, right? It's called Spellbound, by the way, about the relationship. Yes. I still haven't read the book, so I don't want to make any false claims. I'm just talking about the feeling that I get. I don't get this icky, soiled feeling that I sometimes get from watching other, Hitchcock collaborations with his female stars.
Yes, we'll have a look at Donald Spoto's book, but of course the problem is that maybe we'll discuss that. How much can you trust Donald Spoto? That's another question, because he's one of these authors who like when it's dark and so on. But also let's mention one thing, that Ingrid Bergman had great period at the time. I mean, she was also collaborating with George Cukor.
She was after Casablanca,
so great directors. And also when you think about it, I think she's the only blonde that really had an amazing career outside of Hollywood, even outside of Hitchcock. Of course, it's not to say that Kim Novak or Janet Leigh didn't have great performances in other films, but it's not like you don't box Ingrid Bergman as Hitchcock blonde only. So maybe that was there. Maybe he knew that, and maybe that's one of the reasons, which I'm sure we'll come back to that, why he was so disappointed with her leaving him for Europe and for Rossellini. But yes, but the one fact that confirms, as to let back to this topic, what you said, is that she initially rejected the script and this idea, because she said that such a smart lady, such a smart woman is not capable of falling in love so deeply, right? So you sense the different attitude. As an actress, she could say no, for example, initially. She was a very prized possession of Selznick and so on. So yes, the power balance, I think we may safely say, was different in that film.
Yeah, and for me the most amusing thing about this is that when you watch this film today, and the most amusing thing is to just think to yourself that this used to be what was being passed as adult entertainment, like that actually you can imagine those adults in 1945, and it's so much easier to feel superior now 70 years ago after, but that this, I can imagine people like adult people watching this film in 1945 and feeling like, yes, it's very serious, like we need to take a closer look at this psychoanalysis thing. Of course, I'm being completely rude to to the past, ahistorical, but it's fascinating, that this, the Best Picture nomination, fantastic reviews, even from Bosley Crowther and people saying that yes, this is the very, like, that was probably like the basic instinct of its era, that it's adult, it's edgy, it's serious, and we need to keep up with it, right? It's not like we are ahead of the film; it's the film that we need to sort of catch up with to stay modern, I think.
Yes, but two arguments to maybe, let's say, normalize the situation in 1945, which we didn't mention. I briefly mentioned that I think it's a regular A-budget entertainment for 1945, because I think it's the most dreamlike, of course in literal sense, but in general style, is the most dreamlike Hitchcock project since Rebecca. Right. Of course, also because it's a Selznick project. We didn't discuss that as well, but maybe let's come back to that when we'll be discussing the Paradine case. Hitchcock Selznick,
which I'm not looking forward to revisiting. It was so boring. I saw it 20 years ago, but I will revisit it.
We have to do it, Michał. We have to do it. So, but that's one thing, that you have great production values, and you have this. I would say seductive storytelling at times. Mm-hmm. Now, of course, it appears long. Wordy, there are long scenes of conversations. It's not that fun anymore, of course, but there is a seductive style. Of course, the most famous example is the opening doors, which is like this preview of a dream, right? When they kiss for the first time, Ingrid Bergman, we have this image of opening doors.
Well, I always took it straight up as a vagina image, but vagina opening up. But maybe I'm too crass.
That's you, Michał. No, but that's certainly, there's something.
Let's remember the train entering the tunnel in the North by Northwest.
That's definitely an image of sexual awakening, of course. But that's one thing. The other is we didn't mention. We need to at least briefly mention, of course, Salvador Dalí, which, of course, this movie came with this package of Dali being involved to a lesser extent that anyone probably thought at the beginning, right? This was the dream sequence that actually has the whole thing, not even including the commentary that happens, let's say, outside of this dream is like 2 minutes 40 seconds, but it was heralded as this collaboration of great British director with very famous painter and artist and personality, right? This is the point where they could meet each other. Hitchcock and Dali, they were both entertainers, they were both great self-promoters, figures who could...
And Dali was avant-garde, right? I mean, at this time it was commodified avant-garde, but still avant-garde, surrealist avant-garde.
Exactly. So he created. So that's also that's probably the reason why this movie is still in history of film as an important example of this collaboration between these different worlds. Also, Dali apparently wanting to really do more in Hollywood, but of course couldn't really fit into that. But what do you think about? Do you think the sequence is still in any way interesting?
Well, first of all, Salvador Dalí, of course, made 2 films with Buñuel that Hitchcock knew, which was L'Âge d'Or and Un Chien Andalou in reversed order. So he already did the ultimate dream film at that point. Let's not forget that his dream was also to collaborate with Marx Brothers, but that never happened, although there was a script, supposedly, because he valued them as real surrealists. But yeah, I think that at this point it's so commercial to have a Dali, contribution. It's not I mean, it is cutting edge, of course, in Hollywood at that time to have a dream sequence designed by Dali, which supposedly was much longer than what we see in the film. Ingrid Bergman says it was 20 minutes long.
That's not right.
Yeah, that would be too much for everybody. But yeah, at this point, I think it was like a prestige move, and there are touches of prestige all over this film. It has a quote from Shakespeare at the beginning, from Julius Caesar, that the fault is in ourselves. But no, I think I think there's something very commercial about it. That this Dali name at the beginning is like, today that would be like Jordan Peele having his dream sequence designed by Jeff Koons, or something, and there would be a separate like subtitle saying dream sequence designed by Jeff Koons. So, and I have to say, I saw this film many years ago, of course. I mean, revisited now, but I saw it on a big screen because it was actually projected in Krakow from 35mm print from Polish Film Archive.
That's magic.
And I do remember, I really love this score. I think it's very beautiful, this melody, the main theme from Spellbound. But there was always something about this film that I felt about this dream sequence, that was extremely disappointing, because I knew that there will be a Salvador Dalí sequence. I saw the stills. I thought Hitchcock and Dalí, it has to be amazing. And it's so theatrical. It's so uncinematic. It's like, people in those masks and, this set design, which is so late in the day. I mean, this was stuff that Germans did in the 20s. This was stuff that French and, of course, Buñuel did so brilliantly in Chien Andalou, that, to have this done in this Hollywood fashion in 1945, it's like the ballet sequence in American in Paris. You want to see it, but then you are kind of bored that you are seeing it, because it has this heavy Hollywood handling. And of course, with Dalí, the thing is, the cheaper it is, the more powerful it is, because there's nothing cheaper and more horrific than having an eye slashed in half at the beginning of Un Chien Andalou. That was not a special effect. It was an actual eye, not a human one, but still. So here, to have him, design this grand, fantastic, beautiful dream, I will be very cruel. It never felt like dream to me. It felt like expensive set design. And I never experienced it as a truly surprising dream sequence.
It's definitely something maybe that we would wish is more Lynchian approach to dreams, exactly. Right? More, and Hitchcock, of course, that's what he was doing. I'm thinking about Frenzy as this very nightmarish film, like purely on this visceral level of a dream, but also very rationality of a dream, right? That's not here. Although I must say, as I mentioned, I really liked this sequence many years ago. Especially the ending, the man running down the roof. I think I think it's a powerful image. But of course, when you I agree with your opinion when you try to research the history of this scene, which is very long and full of dead ends, like Bergman's comment. I think it's a dead end, right? As she mentioned that it had 20 minutes. It never had 20 minutes. The budget was cut by Selznick. Then Selznick didn't like what was there. That's another thing. And he invited, actually, this is interesting for cinephiles, William Cameron Menzies to reshoot parts of it, right? And then, what was left out of it was like few shots. So yes, so definitely that's a disappointment. So if the only reason you want to watch this film is to see Salvador Dalí and Hitchcock sequence, that's not the reason enough to spend 2 hours with this film.
Exactly, and there are films made at the same time that also have those, like, let's say, dream sequences like Odd Man Out or The Small Back Room by Paul and Pressburger. But you mentioned Lynch, and of course, I think the perfect double bill or the perfect visual essay to make would be to show, the real meaning of the real potential of Spellbound comes out in Blue Velvet. Right down to the casting of the daughter of Ingrid Bergman, who, Isabella Rossellini, who looks the same in many ways. She has the same voice, she has the same look. And what Lynch does in Blue Velvet, with another vulnerable man, by the way, called McLachlan, I think this is the heart that's beating somewhere deep in this contraption that we call Spellbound. But it took another artist. It took another artist from another world, from another time to fully express those very romantic, very confused, violent feelings that Hitchcock was feeling, but he only could express them through this Freudian whodunit.
Yes, so just one of the last points. We, of course, it's a podcast devoted to Hitchcock and we adore him, but I have the feeling that at the time, of course, film noir was there. Let's not forget that, and women in film noir, femme fatale. But I'm thinking, when I was rewatching Spellbound, I was thinking about this, maybe not obscure, but not very well known Fritz Lang movie, Secret Beyond the Door, which is another...
I never saw it.
It's a great riff on Bluebeard's story and Bluebeard's wife. Women full of anxiety. It's a gothic melodrama, you could say, but also the imagery that Lang uses, I think it's much better than Spellbound. And of course, his movies at the time, his 1940s movies, were very much into dark themes and psychoanalysis and so on. But I think Fritz Lang did it better in the mid-40s. So let's not forget that there were other great filmmakers working in Hollywood at that time. And the very last bit of trivia on my part is we must mention the character which we didn't even mention, this weird bit of Hitchcock humor, the old psychiatrist, the mentor of Ingrid Bergman character, right? He's played actually by Mikhail Chekhov, Russian Jewish actor, who actually was considered the most talented disciple of Stanislavski, of Konstantin Stanislavski. Then he left Soviet Union because, of course, people who liked freedom wanted to leave Soviet Union, and then he turned up somewhere in Hollywood in 1940s, and he started in Spellbound, and he is really genuinely he was a nephew of Anton Chekhov, really. So that's a pretty amazing. I was looking for Jewish connections in this film because of course we all know that there were many Jewish psychiatrists up to this day. It's a profession associated, we could say, with Jewish community, at least to a certain extent, maybe not always correctly. So I was looking for these connections in Spellbound, and I think casting of Mikhail Chekhov is precisely that connection.
That's a wonderful bit of trivia, and I will provide another one straight out of the heart of Eastern Europe, because we are Eastern Europeans. Miklós Rózsa, who won the Oscar for this film, was of course born in Hungary, in Budapest. That's a Hungarian last name that he has. He, by the way, also scored The Lost Weekend. So he scored both films that we discussed today. The Lost Weekend actually won the Oscar for the best film, and Rózsa won the Oscar for the best score. The funny thing is, which I actually discovered very recently, is that his last complete score was for Dead Men Don't Wear Plaid, which is a very whimsical film noir film comedy, really, with Steve Martin. So if you want to see like a late,
it's a noir comedy, right?
Yeah. It uses some pieces of old films and incorporates it into this storyline with Steve Martin. So yeah, I don't have anything to add here. I love the Chekhov bit of trivia, and I think that this is a film that has its charms. It's definitely exploring new terrains. I think actually we need to remember that Hitchcock was trying to stay up to the date. Here he is. Let's do something new. Let's do a psychoanalysis, as a theme. So he's very much, trying to push. He's constantly innovating, and we'll see him innovating in the 40s, for example, with 10-minute takes in Rope and with many other things. So he's active. He's on top of things. He's trying to stay up to date, and it's only from the convenient smug hindsight of 2022 that we can make jokes about just how naive the psychoanalysis is here, because apparently at the time of its release, this was the adult entertainment for your evening. This was Spellbound, and our next film will be the juicy piece of cake or a piece of meat or whatever you culinary metaphor you want to use. Notorious.
Bottle of wine, you could say.
Bottle of wine, exactly. Glowing bottle of wine. No, it's a fantastic film. I'm looking forward to it. There's a beautiful, very lush Criterion edition of it. So please watch it in the meantime, and we will be back soon to discuss Notorious. Are you planning to rewatch it soon?
Of course. At least once. I saw it on a big screen. That memory won't fade away, but I'll be happy to watch it at home again.
Okay, so this was a pleasure, and please, if you listen to us, spread the word. This is a podcast that's done on zero budget, with pure love, I would say, with contributions from us both, and from huge technical contribution as well from Sebastian. So please, if you like it, share it, tweet it, Facebook it, TikTok it, whatever. Just make new listeners come to enjoy our show. It's a pleasure for us to be recording those conversations. So this was the 31st episode of Foreign Correspondence.
Deeper into Hitchcock.